Psilos, Technical Consultant for Economic and Workforce Development at RTI International, is available to share his expertise on some of the key challenges that stakeholders in our sector are facing, and also where some promising practices are really strengthening and advancing the sector. RTI International has been our lead partner on the Workforce Development Learning track of our annual Global Youth Economic Opportunities Conference for the past 2 years, and has joined us again in this capacity for this year's conference. And as many of you already know, Phil is both a practitioner and a researcher, and he's really been defining and analyzing the sector's trends through his writing of the Workforce Development Chapter of the last 2 State of the Field and Youth Economic Opportunities publications, among other writings. We're very grateful to RTI and to Phil in particular for their support of knowledge exchange and partnership building that strengthens this field. Now, before I turn it over to Phil, I want to recognize that we have a range of practitioners, funders, and researchers as participants with us today, and we welcome you all to share your questions throughout the webinar as you have them. Phil will try to address them as he goes, and otherwise we'll address them all at the end of his presentation. Please write your questions into the chat box on the left-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And please keep your microphones on mute throughout this learning event to prevent interference. So on that note, I just want to welcome you all on behalf of Making Sense International, and I'll turn it over now to Phil.
Thanks so much, Whitney. Thanks for the kind introduction, and welcome to all 11 of you as of now, although we seem to be adding one a minute or so, one every 30 seconds. So thanks for joining me. It's kind of dark here. I'm presenting from Bangkok this evening. In my home. It's late my time. I know it's early most of your time, but it's glad that you've all joined, and I hope this is going to be a very worthwhile session. So if I would reiterate that if you wouldn't mind typing your just your affiliation in the chat box, your name will come up, but that'll help me understand. I see a couple of familiar names, Tom Owens, I see, okay, Rez from Aga Khan, thanks for joining us. And others, Stera, great, good to see you on. A few RTI colleagues coming in as well. Josh also from Aga Khan, so great. Some names, and I'm sure if I could see your faces, familiar faces from our past workforce development tracks at the Global Youth Economic Opportunities Conference. You know, the conference itself convenes a variety of stakeholders, the practitioners, policymakers, educators, researchers, funders from across the field, from across the Youth Economic Opportunities field, and related ones. And so it's meant to give a picture of who's doing what, where, when, and how. And RTI has been sponsoring the Workforce Development Track since September of 2000. Began a couple after that. So the time during which we've sponsored this track has been rather eventful and really brought a focus on youth workforce development, youth employment issues, youth skills issues. And you know, I've written the State of the Field chapter for the past 2 years. This is now a web-only interactive publication that highlights 3 things, really: the lessons learned from practitioners in the field during the Global Youth Economic Opportunity Conference, which I recognize is quite a mouthful to say over and over again on a webinar, so I may just say the conference. The main challenges, secondly, the main challenge is identify practitioners who are attending informal sessions where we try to come together and define the main challenges of the field. And also a bit of context in the form of key research and donor activity related to the state of the field. As I said, you know, immediately after RTI started sponsoring the conference, I would say there was sort of a transformation in the field where the client group, the awareness of the breadth of the client group for employment-related interventions just grew dramatically from what I would say was a more poorest of the poor or extreme situations of extreme need, as depicted by the young boy in Afghanistan working in a welding factory, might be a welding factory that Aga Khan actually worked with. I'm not sure the origin of that picture, but it's a big difference between young children working in manual labor occupations, and in the upper right corner, Tunisian university graduate employed holding a degree. And so there was really a new alliance, I think, began, or a new sort of forced practitioners and researchers to start thinking a lot more about unemployed university college graduates, and thinking more about how to link programming across a broader spectrum of potential clients. And so I think this first slide is just, this is really the breadth of what we're dealing with, from, computer skills for young women in Africa, young girls in Africa, adolescent girls in Africa, university graduates who define themselves as lacking appropriate skill base, young interns, rather apprentices who are essentially in a survival economy, and young women who are doing traditional home-based jobs and looking for opportunities for advancement into careers that have more of a career pathway forward. A lot of this is captured in the State of the Field publication, and I'm going to put a plug in here and at the end. It can be found here. You can see the website address below, and if you go to the annual publication, I've circled here the 2013 online publication, and then the first chapter tends to be workforce development. And there's a sidebar that can also take you back to the previous years, the 2012 version of this publication. So I think this will give you a more thorough grounding of what we've learned over the past few years, while my presentation today is intended to give you an overview and a bit of a setup for the learning that should happen this year at the conference. All right. Sorry, this is my first webinar, so I apologize for clicking around. Okay. So here's the kind of the outline for today on youth in demand. I want to spend a minute defining the Workforce Development Guild, think about the system as it is, and some of the issues involved in the definition that I just mentioned, wherein the field has come to incorporate more of a focus on college graduates and their employment situations. A couple other issues of new research context and key issues. I'm actually not going to backtrack too much into the research that's been covered in our last 2 years' publications, but instead look at 3 pieces of new research that I think are salient. Then I'm going to kind of give you a bit of a presentation on the key issues that were addressed in the 2011 and 2012 conferences. So there are 7 of those, and I think it's always helpful to know where we're coming from. So we'll be talking a little bit about the lessons learned in those, trying to stay as practical as possible. Section 4 there, remaining challenges, should be really thought about in terms of the challenges that a group of workforce practitioners sorry about that. Can someone tell me the last thing? I guess we're back online now. Can anyone chat to me the last thing you heard from me so we can make sure to start where we left off? Okay. So point 4, remaining challenge in 2011 and 2012, which perhaps perhaps would be better that some of the key challenges that were identified in working sessions in the conference by practitioners. Not all of the challenges or issues. And it's important to remember that this is not an all-inclusive look at workforce development. We highlight initiatives that have been important, try to include more on relevant research initiatives from donors and research entities in the publication. But, I think it would also be useful, given that we're only covering a few of the issues and the issues that were raised during the Q&A portion of this webinar, and we'll post additional resources at the conference website. So, and finally, if there's an issue that you care about, make sure it gets communicated, and also an early plug for next year. We are looking for session proposals from participants for new and interesting content, not only limited to the areas that we think are key challenges, but also, really in terms of the quality of the examples that can be shown. So our final point is the agenda for this year, which should serve as a bit of a preparation. And without further ado, let's get into some of the meat. Are there any questions, table setting questions at this point? Would anybody like to put anything in the chat or any clarifications before we get started? Seeing none. All right. So the next slide gives you an overview of a conceptual framework of workforce development that I like. It comes from the World Bank's SABRE program, and I think it's what I like about it is it's concise and it's also fairly dynamic, because you might think that the system really happens, all the system issues kind of really happen here, even though the interventions that we talk about happen in all of the areas in the economy, in the training system, etc. But I like this because it's the most coherent visual, I think, in terms of the results also of the core issue, which is mismatch of skills to jobs. The term itself, though, workforce development, needs a little bit of clarification, partly because it came up in the United States, where there are pretty distinct and well-funded elements of a public and private training system that this concept of workforce development is built. It's very diffuse. Some people call it a non-system or simply a fragmented system, and a system that operates in different ways in different geographic regions within the U.S. due to local implementation and governance choices. So while the U.S. has never really been particularly known for technical training, technical and vocational education and training in the sort that has been integrated into the school system, very structured, top-down, or rather government and industry collaboration sort of way, which is more typical of European systems. It has been remarkably adept at deploying kind of just-in-time resources to help people into jobs under different circumstances, particularly after 1996, when welfare reform kind of changed the face of the Workforce Investment Act, rather brought the Workforce Investment Act and changed kind of the face of the system in terms of the delivery of services. Now, it's not a perfect transposition into the international and development space, and I think also, I think it's worthwhile continuing to dig in both U.S. and European experiences because there is a well practice. But I think it's also really important to remember that models necessarily very easily transfer. RTI, for example, runs the Department of Education's National Center for Innovation in Career and Technical Education now. And, this is certainly there's a lot that we can bring to the workforce field globally, but there are a lot of issues that aren't as relevant. And I think the next slide, which comes from the Global Monitoring Report from UNESCO, Pathway to Skills, which was a special report on education and training, youth workforce skills in the context of the Millennium Development Goals Global Monitoring Report, shows this pyramid that I think is just a great tool for understanding some of the various challenges in terms of how a young person might walk through education and training in trying to get into remunerative employment. Now, you can see the primary, lower secondary, these second chance, need for second chance pathways into perhaps remedial learning or make-up learning, and then the ladders to base training that tend to occur for second chance students. The crosswalk for upper secondary to work-based training, which is a big theme, and then finally sort of the goal, which is productive and gainful employment. And those jobs look relatively formal. Perhaps not 100% of the formal sector, but this I thought was a nice, a very nice depiction of the system that we're working with, alternate but more youth-focused, with the exception of the exclusion of universities, higher education, which doesn't really factor in. And so I think there's another bridge, and again, we've got to remember the youth employment crisis, extends well into college graduates. And I don't want to spend too much time on that context, but I think it's important that it is to repeat that it is a theme that we've been hearing, and particularly in terms of the latches from universities into work-based learning, familiarity with the workplace skills, and direct experience. So, slide. I'm just going to give you a little bit of information on 3 pieces of research that have come out since the last conference, and I chose these because they provide, I think, important context on some of the key questions that are coming forward. I also think it's salient to mention that we did review extensively the major areas of research last year, including World Bank, Asian Development Bank, OECD, and several others. But so I think, and McKinsey, I think what's come out of the research in the past is clearly that there's, and I think the focus has been rising on the global skills mismatch. So regardless of the level of employment, it's a question of really the adequacy and correctness of the focus of education and training efforts, the method and manner of their interface with the labor market, creating this mismatch, which, if we go back a couple of slides, is really the essence of what causes economies in this model to grow slowly. So you've got a low match between skills and jobs leading to our growth, as opposed to a high match, which leads to a more productive workforce, better employment results, moving up the value chain, and poverty reduction. And I'd say right now, today, that mismatch as the central issue is kind of conventional wisdom, and most of us are working as workforce development practitioners to try to overcome the mismatch in general. Now, the global context for youth development, capturing this mismatch issue, but I'd say going a bit broader and wider, and also really nicely highlighting the magnitude of the youth unemployment challenge, is a paper that's in late draft form that the World Bank has shared with us and allowed us to share with you if you're interested, on youth employment and human development agenda for the next decade. And I think it proposes a conceptual framework to look at how programs may be designed to look at interventions really across all the possible dimensions, a very comprehensive diagnostic tool with policy-level interventions. It might be a little high level for many of our interventions, but I certainly think it provides a language for a wide variety of interventions. Second good piece of research that's lately that's come out relatively recently is a paper global government at RTI funded and Duke and RTI performed. But for OECD, they've kind of taken this to the next level. And this is work on upgrading in global value chains, addressing the skills challenge in developing countries. And they've taken sort of, they've developed a typology that I think can kind of help us meet our clients better where they are, meet national situations where they are. And I would particularly mention this to donors because I think it's very, very important, the distinction that they draw between the types of workforce development interventions that are happening, particularly demand interventions, which they define in three ways: early active interventions, which are we need skills to survive, for our industry to survive. We need to secure current participation in a value chain, which is really the level where I think most of our clients and recipient countries are operating. But there are two additional levels: the ongoing proactive interventions that are develop a qualified workforce for the emerging needs of a specific industry, and then policies, what they're referring to as future-oriented interventions, which are more focused on developing a broadly skilled workforce for the possible future new demands. And I think what's interesting here is that it combines an understanding of value chain upgrading, which is a very common framework for discussing donor interventions on, for industry development, but also a very powerful set of tools for packaging these interventions at the right time and place, understanding where the starting point for our beneficiaries are, what the opportunities are, what the public systems are doing, and then how youth can be positioned to take advantage of kind of the realistic and real progression. So I hope that's clear. I can provide links for these, or we can post the links to all of these following the presentation. Those two, I think, are kind of in the main of the skill mismatch as primary challenge of sort of the global growth situation. But ILO and UNDP have recently released what's shaping up to be a fairly controversial report on rethinking economic growth towards productive and inclusive Arab societies. And the core argument, and this is really the thesis statement of the study, is that actually the mismatch isn't sort of rooted in the root of the unemployment problem, but rather the types of jobs that are being created under the current economic regime and this is specific to the Arab world, but also I'd say it probably applies in many contexts around the globe. So the problem isn't that the skills are missing. In fact, people would acquire the skills if there were good jobs with positive futures. The authors are arguing that it's mainly the type of jobs that are created that make it not really worthwhile to acquire skills. And if in the case of remunerative jobs for youth, there would be a lot more skill accumulation. But the authors also hedge a little bit in this area, in this respect, and say, and we need better linked education and training that's better linked to the labor market. So it's not entirely clear whether where the causality is, but it is interesting to see the argument that really the job generation engines may be broken as opposed to the skill systems. And where you find really low returns to additional education, it may mean that your business community is simply not creating the kinds of jobs that family wage jobs that youth are trying to move into. It also may mean that when they've tried in the past, they're being met with a skills development system that's simply incapable of delivering what they need. So both of those, I think, broaden the perspective on the functioning of the system. Starting to look more, and I think this is important, directly at the employer's role in whether, how and whether they're upgrading, creating jobs. So some of these issues have come up in the past in the conference. This slide just kind of gives you a very broad sense of the content of the last 2 years. And there was an important shift between 2011 and 2012 in terms of moving from sort of a less structured highlighting of best practices that kind of ended up breaking itself out into several issues that I divided into content and process. In 2012, we decided a more thematic approach to the track and try to really look at the experiences that were being offered by presenters and try to group them together in ways that provided a really coherent set of issues. And so these are the issues from 2 years. And as I said, I'm going to choose the seven, I'd say the seven or so most prominent ones to kind of talk about where we've been. So hard skills and credentials are the traditional, if you will, meat and potatoes of technical and vocational education and training programs, and they really are where I think the conversation begins or began. And some of the topics looked at based on some research that RTI and others did, and we did this a little bit in 2010, but also in 2011, was having a really explicit focus on standards, international industry-based skill standards to sync up employers and their industry value chains. And this has actually been incorporated as a USAID. We don't not taking credit for it, but the use of international certifications in workforce and higher education programs is now one of the standard indicators in USAID. So I think that's definitely on the right track. Last year, we also heard from the American National Standards Institute, the first program to actually accredit certifications, which is new, and the proliferation of certifications of varying quality has led a U.S. group to come up with a set of guidelines that I think were very interesting. That was a session last year. Manpower Worldwide, which I'll refer to as MPGW just because it takes up a lot of space, last year really emphasized the need to help employers recognize the option to take students, graduates where they are, work with the imperfect fit, they call it the teachable fit, and look for experience-based resumes that start highlighting hard and soft skills in the absence of credentials or direct experience. I mean, one of the big problems they've identified is that, especially since the employment crisis began a few years ago, in 2008, you have a whole generation of students who haven't really been able to be, in traditional formal labor market contexts. And so documenting experiences out of that context, experience-based resumes that may come from family businesses or other kinds of experiences, seems to be meeting a need. And Manpower Group is a great participant in the conference. They're also a great barometer of private sector thinking on. And another lesson that we in Liberia, a USAID project held in Liberia, which is a university level program, and also CRS in Vietnam in a project aimed at working with disabled Vietnamese young people, is that they're finding a lot of basic skills deficiencies as we are in Liberia in a specifically post-conflict environment, which have to be overcome. I mean, CRS is working with placing disabled Vietnamese students in IT industry jobs, and some of them doing pretty complicated. I mean, we're talking more programming than system maintenance or what have you. So they're finding, and we're finding in Liberia, that applied learning is a powerful way to overcome basic skill deficiencies where we're trying to kind of get learners to a much higher level in terms of technical skills. So, for example, we're finding people who have never used a computer ever in the RTI Liberia Excellence in Higher Education University Centers of Excellence, who are competent CAD and CAM technicians by the end of a year in the program, and learning, infilling a lot of basic skills. CRS Vietnam found this, the motivation of putting students in a 9-to-5 work-like environment and giving them real programming tasks drastically increased their both reading and quantitative comprehension. So I thought that was an interesting sort of, you often have to deal with remedial skill issues before you can get into longer technical training pathways, and this is one that that's interesting. So hard skills, I mean, I'd say the outstanding issue is that hard skills evolve quickly. Employer expectations are often quite high, and the time horizon for building hard skills may be longer than the project appetite. We'll talk a little bit more about how some projects are moving towards a more just-in-time skill development approach, but we're definitely seeing less of the long-term, more than a year training that's characteristic of formal technical vocational TVET systems around the world. A second big issue that comes up, and I'd say we're hearing more and more, relates to soft skills. Now, soft skills, the definitions aren't always clear, but there is some progress in operationalizing them. I'm drawing this social, methodological, personal, and career navigation principally from the some European Union-funded research wherein they're looking for a typology of these skills. Some progress in operationalizing these has also been made by the Manpower Group worldwide, who have acquired a firm that does pretty interesting psychometric testing, job profiling, and I think more importantly, career profiling, so you can actually measure progress over a period of time towards soft skill capabilities that are essentially employer defined. And I think those types of measurement activities whereby employer defined soft skill standards start integrating themselves into educational programs are going to become much more prominent in coming years. Now, another key finding here, and it kind of relates to the last finding under hard skills, is that experiential learning is proving to be very successful in promoting rapid soft skill acquisition. And there are a couple dimensions of this that I thought were interesting, especially Karana last year presenting on their El Salvador Access to Employment project noted that empathy for the customer was something that needed to be developed among a lot of their trainees, especially those who are working in customer-facing retail, first formal sector job, but customer-facing retail where the first instinct from their upbringing, a lot of these are urban youth in San Salvador, which is a pretty rough place, is more conflict-oriented. So just developing empathy for the customer, and in the Education for Employment Foundation, FA's case, in a project in Egypt that they also profiled last year, 2012, in fact, company simulations wherein students are actually defining the requirements and for hiring are a tool for teaching students to put themselves in the shoes of the decision makers, the hiring managers. Fascinating method of pulling students really into an experiential way of understanding then how they'll need to present themselves. If they write a job description or evaluating candidates, they're much more likely to be able to interpret a job description in a way that, for which they can present their own skills. So I'd say that was one of my favorite lessons learned from last year, is just how much progress an educated but unskilled student can make in understanding the job market through these experiential learning processes. Now, internships are obviously a fairly traditional tool for acquiring workplace learning, and so the methodological kinds of soft skills, but they are expensive on a per student basis. And Karana presented some ways using technology for matching students with internship opportunities, and also supports to employers, some of which we'll talk about later. One of those is it's sort of internship in a box, so predefining projects that interns can undertake, and therefore lowering the management costs of such programs as a useful way to proceed. And this idea, and I mentioned this in the title, but that career navigation skills kind of being the fourth pillar, most of the vendors have come to see how to apply for a job, not just how to write a resume, but how to apply for a job, how to understand a job description, how to understand a career path, etc. Very much incorporating themselves into into practitioner experience of late. A final note that came also from a number of different projects and that were highlighted in the past two of these were the branding issue. We have heard about some efforts ongoing, including IYF, to measure soft skill acquisition in a way that's empirical and evidence-based. But until such time that there's a standard way of doing so, the project branding, the branding that projects have in their presentation or interaction with employers in country, really ends up conferring upon students a brand that creates some expectations about what soft skills they're likely to have. And so, in a sense, the soft skill is one side of the coin, rather one side of the picture, and the other side being employer engagement, and they seem to be less and less separable, which I think is a useful lesson, that the value of your soft skills program is essentially equivalent to the value and trust of your program in the private sector employer network. Now, soft skills remain a moving target. One of my concerns and hesitancies when I first hear about a new question of soft skills, there are some problems with the soft skills as a whole. I often am concerned that sexual age discrimination against youth may sort of be, soft skills may be code for they don't do it like we used to. There are some academic studies that suggest soft skills in the American labor market are a form of coded racism. Differences in social behaviors can be lumped under soft skills and rejected, together. So I think that there are some potential problems. We need to remember they're a moving target, and the better we can define what we mean and work with employers to define this. And I'm going to go back to the manpower example. That's why I think ways in which they're defining these in a very granular level, in a very employer-based level, and testing for them in a way that's objective, I think is a very promising dimension, or rather a promising development. So one of the themes that mainly came up in 2011, but then became embedded, sort of as a standalone, but then became embedded in all of the conversations, is the idea of multi-sectoral partnerships. Thematic, not exactly, but implementation methodology. And rather than trying to describe even a fraction of them, I'll just say that some of the key lessons learned that we heard from multiple implementers, the local private sector, rather public sector's involvement, and that may be local national government or local government, is that without their involvement, there's really a much higher risk of failure. So rather than being necessarily a key to success, eliminating resistance to new programs by involving the local public sector is a key lesson learned, and ultimately reducing the risk of failure reduces costs as well. Local NGO communities, I think, are the big winner, if you will. Localization, sustainability, and networks all being derived from local NGOs, either in partnership or in some cases implementers are actually helping to catalyze the setup of local entities. The local international private sector is, of course, a key one. We're going to talk more on the next slide, and that's because they're where the jobs live, and without them, pretty much all of these training exercises and other here has also come up. Donors, of course, are a key part of the partnership, but often take a bit of a different role there. The education sector, I think, is a tricky one because it remains, and we'll see this in a moment, one of our key challenges is the fact that nobody's really has a great method for working with very broken education systems yet, and we do hear consistently about the failures of public systems in particular, but also increasingly private higher and technical education systems in failing to deliver skills that are needed. So this employer-private sector engagement, there are a number of very tangible and concrete lessons, some of which are broad enough that I don't attribute them to any presenter in particular in past conferences. Giving early influence in program development is one of those that we heard from a lot of people and can synthesize. So don't come to them after the program is already designed, but make sure that not only in terms of skill requirements, but also in terms of participation requirements and pathways, timing, and other issues, early influence is important. Appealing to the business's bottom line rather than to altruism, and then operationalizing that in terms of at least 4 dimensions here. One is reducing recruiting costs by providing a conduit for businesses to find skilled graduates. Good public relations. So selling participation in your project is good public relations. That's really the squishiest of these, closest to altruism. I think it can be made as a business case as well, and should be. Youth comfort with technology. Businesses actually benefit from having younger people who are good at webinars, better than I am at webinars, for example. Good at social media, good with Facebook and Twitter and other and websites, just in general. So there's independent value of working with youth that needs to be communicated. And then the role that projects can have in helping small and medium enterprises, to develop human resources policies that provide career paths, but also help meet their own needs and in terms of professionalizing their own workforces. One that we also heard is that there's a need for radical honesty about program capabilities and limitations, that businesses are likely to walk away if they feel like there have been empty promises. Working through local NGOs, also heard from FA in 2011, brings programs a lot closer to local employers because of the and the local private sector, because of the they're likely to have extremely close relationships with local businesses. Focal points in career centers, I thought, was an interesting topic from IYF in Egypt in 2011. Providing focal points in school-based or university-based or technical training center-based career centers also provides a level of comfort, and again, appeals to the business bottom line by reducing recruiting costs. And finally, Kirana last year in 2012 presented a very interesting model for just-in-time training, in which students may be selected initially through a call that's put out on social media and screened for interest in positions for which they are essentially given pre-entry training and can be in jobs in as little as 3 to 4 weeks. And so they've really pioneered a kind of just-in-time workforce development and training, skill development and training, pre-employment training that I thought was very promising for getting people young people into their first jobs in a way that really just cuts out a lot of the process and just goes to it, very much on a private sector calendar. Kirana pointed out that when private sector needs employees, they need them now, and while we may not all be comfortable with moving so quickly, it's extremely useful to be able to demonstrate that you can move people into jobs in that kind of short time horizon. So one of the takeaways here, or issues remaining, is that mutual understanding and a willingness to invest are often lacking in these relationships and need to be cultivated and developed. Willingness to invest, I think, even private sector representatives who came to to the conference, which is itself an investment, when asked would they continue working with programs if they had to pay for their services, they always seem to hedge their bets. That's a business decision as well. So I think as a community, that's one we can take into consideration. Empowering girls and young women was a big focus in 2012. Key lessons, many of these from EDC's evaluation efforts for USAID, suggesting a broad range of flexible skills are needed to accommodate variable career paths, not just vocational skills, but employment and entrepreneurship, recognizing that girls and women will be in and out of the workforce more often than boys and men, and need to be able to take advantage of a greater variety of opportunities. We, through our eHealth program in Liberia, we demonstrated how direct outreach to girls in their junior and senior years of high school can get them into get our program clients into non-traditional roles in engineering and agriculture. It has to be a very, very direct and often I'd say relatively expensive process of being explicit about overcoming traditional gender roles. Another lesson that EDC and also Save the Children pointed out was that the deeper the community involvement in your project, the more space be made for girls' participation and leadership in the economy. So really that community involvement has to be sort of table stakes at all stages along the way to make sure that there's community support for breaking out of traditional and less remunerative, less promising roles for girls and women. And then finally, another shared conclusion is that girls' issues need to be addressed throughout the project cycle, not just in the planning phase. And several evaluators found that the planning phase was great. There's a lot of good intentions, especially international NGOs bring and implementers bring great intentions in designing programs that are aware of and girls and women's issues, empowering, but that when it comes to local implementation, you have to be extremely vigilant to make sure that decisions are taken on a week-by-week and month-by-month basis in order to ensure that the good intentions translate into real results and outcomes. So many successes, many setbacks in empowering girls and young women through workforce development. A couple of special circumstances and special populations, conflict-impacted areas. We had some participatory assessment methods presented in 2012, participatory being the key to really embracing the subjective experience of those who are impacted by conflict rather than overlaying our template of their experience. MEDA and Aga Khan Foundation Canada, I'm sorry I've got the abbreviation wrong here, did a suitability tool, and part of that relates to the suitability of interventions in conflict areas, which I thought was presented last year in kind of outline form and which was covered in the publication last year. It's also important to creatively address educational and institutional deficiencies. Both RTI and MEDA, to some extent, looked at this issue in 2012, noting that kids from conflict and post-conflict situations are going to come with unusually large either variability, as in the case of Liberia, or just plain very large education gaps. And building in the flexibility to address these, which are often larger than anticipated, is very interesting. And then remedying interpersonal damage. In Karana's case in El Salvador, this related to, well, actually in both Karana and Creative, this was most explicitly discussed in the context of gang participation and crime-based violence. And so there were there's a lot of need to address that. Creative presented some interesting experiences wherein ex-gang members went on a reality TV show in Central America to show what they could do. and I think sort of helped carve out a new niche for those who might otherwise be excluded. Clients with disabilities, or another special population that CRS and also Marriott Foundation's Bridges from School to Work presented on in 2012. 3 lessons here that I think stood out. One is focusing on the abilities and the value add of disabled program participants as they relate to the employer's core business is really the best way to get. It's not altruistic. It's really a problem-solving approach. Secondly, advocating to and educating employers on what can happen, and very relatedly, providing to employers or advocating to and educating employers, and also helping provide them with the sort of the services, the understanding that they need to handle questions of disability in their workplace. So educating them about how to deal with disability themselves provides independent value and creates space for opportunities for youth. And then providing or facilitating wraparound services and psychosocial supports to disabled students who, given these opportunities, may not have had a lot of experience with similar, especially formal sector opportunities in the past. So that's I'd say the major lessons in that area. I'm not going to have time to do this question justice, but we did a special sideline survey on measuring outcomes, and Estera Barbarossa from RTI led this survey. I believe she's still with us. So thanks for joining us, Estera. There is a worldwide consensus that outcome measurement needs to improve. Most programs are tracking 3 to 6 months out. They're tracking employment and some degree of wage outcomes. There are a lot of complications in keeping track of youth, and there's not a lot of really experimental data on outcomes. There's little evidence of causality in terms of outcomes. There's a lot of selection bias, a lot of risk of cream skimming in selecting youth for workforce programs, and there are very few control groups about whom information is gathered. So benchmarks and comparisons across programs are very difficult. There are some good practices using external evaluators, tracking graduates using new methods, including mobile technology, social media, alumni groups, social network approaches, which are cheaper than telephone surveys and can become sustainable in some ways. Measuring job quality, Karana and EDC both show that they're looking at not only employment and remuneration, but also terms and contracts and contractuality and wage levels and other paid vacation benefits, etc. All very good measures. Part of that is because the USAID facts standard indicator, improve alignment in data collection to try to look at ways that are non-monetary that improve employment. And also EDC is working on improving really direct skill measurement, and so more will be seen on that, and I hope we can learn more this year. So challenges overall identified by the workforce development track participants in formal sessions were fairly similar, actually, across the 2 years. In 2011-12, the system-wide reform challenges directly mirrored in 2012 to 13, working with broken TVET and workforce development systems. The enabling environment, micro and macro, came up in your monitoring and evaluation, measuring impacts and value for money, and looking at the need for better standardization in tools and shared resources. And one that I thought was important was, looping this back to the very beginning, which is in many cases, if the private sector isn't creating jobs, there's only so much the education and training systems, no matter how good they are, workforce development systems can be. So dealing with rising expectations in a crisis is difficult for the practitioners. In addition, last year we looked at specific challenges of working with the private sector, roles, approaches, and planning, requirements of job placements. We don't want the most disadvantaged to get lost in the new emphasis on college graduates, on less skilled college graduates, and also the potential impact of massive online courses, massive open online courses, or SPOCs, small private online courses also may be just as powerful going forward. So we have a lot less time to talk about topics coming up, but they include in this year's conference, September 10th, 11th, and 12th at the IDB in Washington. Quite a bit, and this is just the workforce development related content. It includes e-learning and mobiles and technology, 4 separate sessions on these issues. The 3 R's for work readiness, partnering with the private sector in the new economy, measuring soft skills, which is on the M&E track rather than on the workforce development track, which I think is going to be very interesting, and fairness, participant selection is a key issue. Our track has been selected. I think it gets at a number of the challenges, but not all, from last year. We'll hear from IYF, CIDE, Silotech, and Microsoft on technology and providing impact at scale. We'll hear from Mercy Corps, Creative Associates, and EDC on youth ownership in program design and implementation, which is sort of a cross-cutting challenge, how to get youth more involved. And a study that RTI, led by Esther Barbarasa, did for a review of the Multilateral Investment Fund, IDB's youth portfolio, found that was really a key area of learning and a key need in terms of youth involvement in program design. So we've kind of drawn the line to that, and we'll hear some interesting experiences from 3 leading implementers. Higher education partnerships. As university education and scaling university graduates becomes a more prominent focus, at least in USAID's development, the U.S. Developing World University Partnerships become higher profile. RTI will bring Rutgers, one of our key partners, both in Liberia and on a newly launched project in Philippines. We'll partner with the Higher Education for Development entity, kind of a sub-program of aid, and they'll bring leaders of Nassau Community College to talk about sort of what's in it for both sides. MTC, Manpower Training Corporation, Restless Development, and Save the Children will talk about engaging employers at a partnership level, and IYF will bring partners Hilton and Accenture to address the question of addressing employers' demand for soft skills. So, and I'm sure there will be surprises awaiting all of us in Washington. In the interim, I hope we have time, a little bit of time for questions. You can reach me at these coordinates if you have follow-on questions. And you can find a lot more on all of these resources at the Making Sense YouthEconomicOpportunities.org website. Thanks for your time and attention. And I'll stick around for questions as long as you guys would like to guys, I'm sorry I use that so casually. I'll drop into y'all as long as y'all would like to stay. If there are questions, I'd be happy to address those, either text or voice.
Thank you very much, Phil, for this very thorough and thought-provoking presentation. We really do appreciate it. And we will ask those who have questions to please send you emails, as we do have to wrap up this webinar. I just hope that you'll all join Phil and the rest of us at the Global Youth Economic Opportunities Conference, which, as Phil mentioned, takes place September 10th through the 12th. It will be at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C., moved from the IDB. And if you haven't yet registered, we ask you to please do so by visiting that web page that is noted on Phil's last slide, and that's just /conference, and you'll reach the registration page through there. And we also invite you to share your resources, such as publications, toolkits, or any other guides that you have related to workforce development. We'd be happy to feature them through this website here, and you can actually upload them directly. So thank you all for participating today, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks, everybody.